Shalom, Dr. Dina Dye here with Foundations, and we are working through our series In the Beginning. We left off last time, I introduced the whole concept of the king, because as we've gone through the first chapter of Genesis, essentially, we've come to the part of Shabbat. And Shabbat really was a declaration that the house had been completed and the king was sitting enthroned on his throne in his palace on that day. That things in the kingdom had come to a place of rest, enemies had been defeated, and so the king was ruling and reigning from that place. Our Sabbath, Shabbat, our seventh, should be a place where we enter into his presence and worship him as the king sitting on his throne. The king is a very important part of the world of the ancient Near East. The various kings ruled under their deity in the cities of, say, ancient Mesopotamia. The kings were given the pattern and design of the house, the temple for the god, and they would be the ones responsible to serve as the sort of foreman in order to build the house. Sometimes when the god came into, the previous king had been defeated, for example, the god decided he wanted a new house, and so something had to be built. The king was essentially responsible. And the king had a lot of other responsibilities as well. And I'd like to just encourage you to think about Adam as being the first king. Now, of course, the sphere, the sacred space that he was supposed to rule in was going to be contaminated because of his sin, and so he was removed from that environment. But to my mind, he wasn't removed as being king, because out of his line, all of the kings of Judah that would rule and reign come forth from him, from Adam all the way down to the Yeshua, the Messiah, considered to be the second Adam, and we can trace the genealogy all the way back. I just want to remind you that, for instance, Abraham, when he was given, the covenant was confirmed with him, with God in Genesis chapter 17. If you read closely in the verses, it talks about out of Abraham's loins will come kings. And farther down, a few verses down, it will also say, out of Sarah's loins will come kings, or out of her womb, essentially, will come kings. And so kings come down through the lines of the kings. There's no commoners here. So we have this thread all the way through. So now it's important that we begin to understand and lay some groundwork for what it was like for a king in the ancient world, how a king was supposed to rule and reign. And obviously we can make application for our God and for our King Messiah. He's going to fulfill all the same requirements. The king has a direct line to his God in the ancient world, in the same way we see that Yeshua has a direct line to our God. The king holds a similar position as high priest, and Adam, first king over the garden, also served and functioned in the role of a high priest. We see that played out at the time of the Hasmoneans, which is around about 160 BCE. Of course, you're familiar with Judah HaMaccabee. He became sort of the first king of the Hasmonean Empire. But they took on the role of king and high priest because that was normal. And so the king also was responsible to officiate some of the offering service in that sacred environment. He would pray and intercede, if you will, on behalf of the people. We see Yeshua functioning much the same way. The king was to pronounce blessing on the congregation, and his role was to bring fertility and fruitfulness and prosperity and blessing to the people. He was responsible for that. And the king since he had a direct line, he would receive revelation from his God, and in our case, from God directly. He was, the welfare of the people, as I just mentioned, was everything. And he was supposed to operate in a place of righteousness and justice. That was the nature of who the king was. And that was how he was supposed to rule and reign. We see the very opposite happening in the empires around Israel. So Israel was always oppressed by a foreign nation, Babylonians, Persians, Romans, etc. And the rulers of those nations were the oppressors. And they did not have the welfare of the people at heart ever. So we understand, even in a modern age, that totalitarian dictators never have the benefit of the people in mind. They're not benevolent in any way. Usually they murder anyone who might even be a threat. But that was not the way the king was supposed to operate. And so it is through his righteousness and justice that blessing and fertility would come to the land and would come to the people. And so, in a sense, his sin became the people's sin, and his righteousness became their righteousness, because in some way they were one and the same. And so this is how the ancient world functioned in terms of the king, and certainly we see this played out even going down into the Gospels and the epistles. And so the ancient Near East world, Mesopotamia, a little review here, but the king, every king in ancient Mesopotamia had the same title, and that title was Son of God, what we would say in Hebrew, Ben Elohim. And we can see examples of Yeshua being called Ben Elohim because he is, after all, the king. That is his title, Son of God. The king in the ancient world was adopted let me back up here, as the son of the king was raised up to become the king. He was described as being the adopted son. He was described as being reared by the ancient gods and goddesses. Of course, that's in ancient Mesopotamia. The son raised up as king was endowed with certain divine attributes. And in particular, not only the attribute of power, but the attribute of wisdom. And this is key in understanding the story of Solomon, because Solomon he was David's son. He was raised up. As the literal son, he was said to be mortal, but when he was raised up to become king, it was as though he became divine. And what was the main attribute given to Solomon? Well, it was the attribute of wisdom. We see that played out in the book of Proverbs, some in Psalms, and we see the amazing wisdom that Solomon was given. And that was true in the ancient Near East world as it was in the world of ancient Israel. In fact, some of the scholars describe the whole creation process, Genesis chapter 1, as an architectural pattern, and that wisdom is played out through the entire first chapter of Genesis. And we'll see in the ancient world that wisdom was very much a part of the kingship. We know that in Proverbs 9 and Proverbs 24, it talks about wisdom as a woman building her house, because wisdom was the main attribute for building a house. One required wisdom, knowledge, and understanding in order to build a house. Again, the king was the channel through which fertility and blessing flowed from the king to the people. Now, it would go from the king's God, the deity, over the king, and to the people. And so we see the same thing played out with Yeshua the Messiah, as he's in direct contact with his God, our God, and the blessings of God flow through the king out to the people to bring peace and fertility and a life that's prosperous in many different ways. And all of that, again, function in the context of the land, because the land was the inheritance that was given to the king, and the king passed down to his son. And so that's part of what we would call the land grant covenant. The king, ultimately the right king who ruled and reigned with mercy and justice and righteousness, was the one who brought material and spiritual blessing and well-being to the people. Now, it's not hard for us to see that we are looking for our king and kingdom to operate in the same way. We live in a world of chaos, and basically creation, it feels like everything's crumbling all around us, and we look forward to our king taking his place on the throne, ruling and reigning, because the enemies have been defeated, and blessing and prosperity and peace come to the land. That is the nature of our kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, and that is what we long for and we look forward to, because we recognize the chaotic waters seem like they have completely covered the earth, and everything is in a state of decay and entropy and completely falling apart. So the Bible speaks of this throughout, and we look forward to when the creation is restored and the king sits on his rightful place on the throne. That is his temple, which was the palace, his royal throne. And his land, always the king's land, included the garden and the environs around the temple, his royal land that the king would pass on to his son. Certainly we see that as we go through all the various kings of Judah and Israel. So what we call the royal grant. It's a royal grant covenant, is what the king passed on to his servant, or the king, if it was a familial relationship between the king and the servant, it would be as though it were from father to son, that inheritance. So the inheritance was the land, the throne, and the seed. Those were all part of the grant covenant, and it played an important role in the ancient kings. Now, I've talked in the past about the idea of the Holy of Holies being that throne room. So in the temple, the picture we have, of course, is the Ark of the Covenant, was said to represent the seat, the throne, the place where God would put the soles of his feet. But of course, in the Ark of the Covenant being in the Holy of Holies was the place in which the king priest, high priest, could enter in and meet with God and hear from him and receive instructions in order to be given wisdom to govern the people. That's how that operated. So the king enthroned meant that the seed was preserved and protected. The Ark of the Covenant, again, seen as a throne. And if we, again, go back to the garden, the first land description here we have is of the garden. The idea of in the midst of the garden, pointing to that inner sanctum, the place of the Holy of Holies. And Adam, again, being Son of God, Adam is described as Ben Elohim, the Son of God, and again, that is a title. Every single king in the ancient world, Mesopotamia, was called the Son of God, so that's nothing unusual. But it is interesting for us, we are B'nai Elohim, or the sons of God. Now, oftentimes in Scripture will be translated children, because children and sons are rather interchangeable. But my premise is that sons is a better term. First of all, sons are the ones that would build the house through seed. Daughters, by contrast, are actually called the house. So the temple is a house, but it's also a daughter. And so we see in Scripture the daughter, virgin daughter of Zion. We see the temple described in terms of a female daughter, virgin daughter, etc., etc. So sons, again, are the ones responsible to build the house. So in the end, we could argue that the Bible is really the story. The focus of the story is on the kingly line from Adam to the second Adam. Now, it's not that it doesn't go off and talk about other families. There's various narratives, but the focus of the Bible is the unfolding of the kingdom and the unfolding of the rightful king on his throne to restore all of creation. I mean, that basically is the Bible in a nutshell. Now, we tend to focus in on Yeshua, the Messiah. He's come to seek and save that which was lost. He's come to save us. But this is the picture is much bigger on this. It is all about the restoration of the kingdom. And it is all about Messiah taking his legal place on the throne to bring peace and prosperity and that benevolence to the nation. And the land is important. You can't, God has designated that land. It is the land that it's part of the line of the kings from Adam, again, the garden, all the way down to the Messiah. And it is our inheritance as well. And it's in a specific place on the earth, and that there will be a time that where our king will rule and reign from that place. And so the Bible really speaks of that. The idea of the temple in the ancient world is that it is the center of power. This is important. The power, the control, and the order obviously functions better when the king is a benevolent king. But even in the ancient Near East world, you had lousy kings. They would rule with an iron fist, etc. But the temple was ground zero. It was the center of power and control, and it brought order to that environment. It's a place of fertility, prosperity, peace and justice. These are attributes that we long for, to see peace and justice come, because there is no peace, and because the King of Kings is not ruling and reigning from the place that he should be. We look forward to that day, and we understand that there will be a time when there will be peace. The temple in the ancient world was the center for their economics and commercial adventures. It was the legal and moral center. And I know it's difficult for us to understand this, but we have information from the Second Temple period in which the high priests, which they were, most of them, not all, were quite corrupt. and they were corrupt in terms of commerce. And they were charging interest on debt to the folks in the context of the temple. And they were in league, in an unholy alliance with Rome. And there was extortion, graft, and you name it going on at that particular time. The Second Temple had been corrupt in terms of commercial ventures. And so the temple was the center for economic and legal and civil and judicial, all of that. That was the government, essentially. It was the central organizing institution for the ancient world. And it was the place out of everything functioned from that point. So, as any government, was everyone called to serve in the government? Well, no. You have, for our government, you have certain ones that are in a representative government that go to a place, Washington, D.C. in our case, to serve and represent the people. Not everybody is a representative in that way. Not everyone's a senator or serves in the House. Not everyone's president. So these people are to represent us to bring peace, prosperity, and blessing upon the land. And so the ancient world functioned in much the same way. Not everyone was a priest. So those that were called as priests would go and work in the institution of the temple, serving and representing the people to bring blessing and prosperity to them. The temple was really the bond that held the community together. It was the focal point. So in the same way, in our country, the center of government, Washington, is supposed to be the place that holds the nation together. It's central. Not everybody lives there, but it's supposed to operate to bring the community into one, to make the community whole, to bring a glue that would hold us together. But typically it does exactly the opposite. But that was the purpose and function of the temple. The temple was also the very source of wealth for the community. Think about the Second Temple, which was considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world under, of course, King Herod building that temple. And a very wealthy place, and gold and silver, and just it must have been amazing to see. Josephus describes it in many ways as this just amazing white, like a mountain, looking like snow, dazzling with gold, etc., etc. But that was the source of wealth. Now, high priests, for instance, in the Second Temple, serving in that environment, were corrupted by that. There's a reason that Timothy says that the love of money is the root of all evil, and that's true everywhere. I mean, that takes us back even to the garden, because any formal institution like that, people can be corrupted by wealth and blessing, etc. And so we see that. Now, I want to turn for a second to some of the description we have of the Sumerian temple. This is from something called the Hymn of Kes. So I want you to see sort of some similarities in here. And then Gudea was the king of Lagash in ancient Mesopotamia. You were building my house for me, speaking of the king ruling over that area. And you were having the offices performed to perfection for me. Now, the for me is the deity. You had my house shine for me like Utu in heaven's midst. I hope you can see kind of a similarity here as the king is, the deity is describing what the king is supposed to do over the city and to build the house. You had my house shine for me like Utu in heaven's midst, separating like lofty foothill range heaven from earth. Again, the temple represented the temple in heaven, even in the ancient world, and the deity ruled from that temple above. Now, these are some names of the temples in the ancient Mesopotamia. Ashara, which meant house of the cosmos. So again, that follows a similar pattern. Etmenenki, the house of the foundation, platform between heaven and earth. You can see the same thing, the idea of the primordial hillock, the dry ground appearing, a house being built, the foundation of the house, sometimes called the platform, and in this case, the platform between heaven and earth. We find that in Egyptian temples, they were described as being built on a primeval hillock, the first land that would emerge from the cosmic waters, just as we see it described in Genesis 1, chapter 9, that the dry ground appears for a purpose, to build a house. So finally, one of the names, which I found very interesting for the Jerusalem temple, was called the heaven and earth. So isn't that interesting when we go all the way back to Genesis 1:1? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So there's a covenant made between God and his house, the Jerusalem temple being called heaven and earth because it functioned as that center point, that connecting point between heaven and earth, where the priest would serve and help the people enter into a relationship with God the King. Temple was a place for, of course, all the services and ceremonies, which most of were ritual renewal ceremonies. The idea was to restore creation. So many of these ceremonies had within them the idea of restoring a relationship, but restoring creation. In particular, the water drawing ceremony at Sukkot, which that particular ceremony had everything to do with sort of a cycle of the waters of creation returning back. So I'll quickly describe that particular ceremony, the water drawing. So the water came from the Gihon spring, which was actually a place where Solomon was anointed king. And under Hezekiah, a temple was built from the Gihon down to the pool of Shiloah, the pool of Siloam, and that was to protect the water supply from the Assyrians who were going to attack. And that canal was constructed through solid rock. And on the day for the water drawing, when the high priest, would go down to the pool of Shiloah from the temple, that was down below in the shadow of the temple, and he had a golden vessel, and he would draw water, just a measured amount. I think it was only half a liter. And he would take the water, and he would make his way back up to the temple, passing through the water gate, where they would sing, "Therefore with joy shall you draw water from the wells of salvation." That was from Isaiah 12:3. And the high priest would make his way into the temple precinct area, and he would go up onto the altar. And now there were these two bowls on top, connected to the altar. One was the bowl where wine would be poured out for the libation offering, and that happened pretty much every day, morning and afternoon. At Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, there was another bowl there for the pouring out of the water. Now, this is the only time in the year in which water was poured out on the altar. So he had an associate priest with him. One priest would pour the wine, the high priest would pour the water, and the hole in the bottom of these bowls, if you will, where the holes were designed so that water and wine would pour out at the same time, and they would go down under the altar, and eventually the water would run back into the Kidron Valley and make its way down to the Gihon River to the spring. And so it's as though it made a complete cycle from the Gihon all the way back to the Gihon. And the high priest was responsible for pouring out the water on the altar. And this was said to represent a creation ritual, a restoring of creation in this act. And of course, most of the information we have about this comes from the Mishnah and the Second Temple period. We don't actually know if this was done in the First Temple. There's some hints to it in the Tanakh in the Old Testament, but this is one of the examples of a creation renewal ritual. And really, in effect, the seventh day, the Shabbat, is an example of the creation rituals being restored. But really, all of the ceremonies of the temple, I think the more we learn them and understand them, we'll see how creation is being restored through those rituals. Of course, in the ancient world and in the world of ancient Israel, they always had these New Year's festivals. Those were times in which the king was rededicated, and where the temple itself was rededicated. Very important times in the year. So in Judaism, we have Rosh Hashanah, which is the head of the year. In the ancient world, that would have been a time when the king was crowned or enthroned, and so there's a rehearsal or a rededication of that every year. And certainly in the part of the ancient world, the Babylonians had theirs, called Akitu, which took place in the spring. It was a 7-day festival. So always in the ancient world was this idea of New Year's being raised up and crowned king, but then rehearsed year after year. And they were rehearsing the order and harmony that came to the community, came to the temple. The temple created this stability and order, so they were rehearsing that. So again, the New Year's always had within it the idea of creation renewal, these rituals, these rehearsals, a rehearsal for the creation drama, if you will. And it included an aspect of ritual death, like, for instance, if one was immersed, it was though one was dying, going down into the earth and then being raised up. And that's a picture of resurrection of the king. We see that being celebrated each year. And all of these things, that the same pattern repeated in both. And of course, in Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, there are, as we celebrate, there are many themes in that particular festival that we have that are, you can see kingly themes in it. For instance, the resurrection. We see it's a time of the coronation, a time of judgment. We see it's a time of repentance as well, teshuvah, to return. There are many similar themes in Rosh Hashanah as with the coronation of the king and a restoration of that. So again, all of this, speaking of the king triumphing over death, and then the New Year's ritual would be followed by a marriage, and part of that marriage would be the begetting of the race, the seed coming forth. So all these things, resurrection, enthronement, marriage, all that. Now, Rosh Hashanah takes place the first of the month, first day of the 7th month. And so we have it as a New Year's ritual. So I'm not going to go into that anymore, but we'll pick it up next time. We'll continue on this theme of the king and the restoration of creation, and trying to match the pattern of the ancient world with what Israel's doing. And let me just say, there are differences in that Israel, I believe that the ancient world was rather copying Israel than the other way around. But we see that there are a lot of similarities. So we'll pick it up next time. We'll see you again. Thanks for joining me. Shalom.